So last week I set one of the first EU cognitive assessment tests that the EU institutions used in the context of an EU competition. And this, I want to say it from the start, was an internal EU competition, but I'm making this video because when the EU institutions, they pilot a new assessment, there is always a possibility that it will later be used more broadly and in the context of external competitions or EPSO competitions, however you want to call them. And we don't know whether this format will be eventually used for EPSO competitions, but we can certainly exclude that possibility. So I think it would be useful to give my impressions and to provide some examples of how this test works. So I thought I would share my experience and explain what type of questions I encountered, and give some practical examples and advice if you ever take this type of assessment in the future. I want to stress right from the start that this was a test that I did in the context of an internal competition. So as I said, not an external, and it was provided by the SHL platform, a platform that you can publicly find online. You can go to the website, and in fact I'm planning to drop down in the comments a link to this platform where you can also sit and try a trial test. So you can practice and see how these questions look like. But in addition to those questions, as I said, I will provide my examples and my experience to give a better overview of how this test was, especially compared to the previous preliminary tests that EU competitions have organized in the past, like the numerical and the abstract reasoning. And when it comes to this numerical and abstract reasoning, I have to say that this cognitive assessment test was slightly different. It was a mix of numerical questions, equations, logical assumptions, abstract reasoning. So he mixed up the numerical and abstract questions that you would normally encounter in EPSO and EU competitions, but in a slightly different way. I won't disclose the type of questions I got. Of course, I will use some examples that are a bit tailor-made based on my experience and designed to illustrate the type of reasoning that was being tested. But the bottom line is that my overall impression was that this type of assessment was a bit different from the traditional EU reasoning tests. And rather than having a separate numerical reasoning test and a separate abstract reasoning test, the assessment mixed, as I said, several cognitive skills together. And in fact, I mean, you are very likely to encounter questions involving percentages, but at the same time equations, a lot of equations of different degrees of difficulty. I have to say some of them, they were quite hard, but still quite regular equations. Logical reasoning, there was a lot of logical reasoning, not just abstract, but also, like for instance, finding slots within people's availabilities and in the context of organization of events and meetings, problem solving, as I said, scheduling problems, different types of problems coming out of, for instance, percentages or items produced in this or that country. Interpreting incomplete information, that was also quite often the case. As I said, arranging percentages in the context of pie charts and identifying partners and so on and so forth. I have to say that I found the test overall slightly more difficult than the traditional preliminary assessment tests that the EU institutions carry out, especially when it comes to the numerical reasoning. The numerical reasoning tests in the context of EU competitions, in my view, are normally a bit easier. And in this context, in the context of this cognitive assessment test, I found that the equations were particularly challenging, especially when it comes to time management. In fact, you had 24 questions to reply to in the time frame of 36 minutes, and you will be quite a lot under pressure. But let's dive right into the examples that I was planning to give. So I came up with 3 different examples based on my own experience, and these reflect more or less the type of questions I had. But as I said, I'm not disclosing anything confidential. You can go to the platform and try out these tests if you like. You can try them out yourself. There are practice tests, so you will see it firsthand. But the type of questions that I got were basically the following. The first one I will refer to building an equation, and I will also share maybe an example in the video so you can see it in a Word document. So about building an equation, imagine like a situation where you're told that Europe sold 420 products, so 420 items of a certain type of item. At the same time, you have Asia, where 280 products or items were sold. And in America, 500 products were sold. So you are told that in Africa, 20% of the worldwide total of items or products were sold. And the question is, how many products were sold in Africa? And at least my reasoning when it comes to these questions would be, first, I would add the 3 continents whose sales we already know. I would add them all together so we have actual figures and actual numbers as regards Europe, Asia, and America. So I would add up 420 plus 280 and 500, and we would get to a number of 1,200. Now, the important point is that Africa is part of the worldwide total, we are told in the question, by the question. So we know that Africa is part of the worldwide total. So we cannot simply calculate 20% of 1,200, right? Because the final total will also include the figures relating to Africa. So in this circumstance, I would call Africa's sales, Africa's products or items, however you want to call them, as X. And the worldwide total would therefore be 1,200, so the sum of those 3 continents that we already know, plus X, which, as you know, represents Africa. So Africa represents, we know, 20% of this total. So what does it mean? It means that X, Africa, is 20% of 1,200 plus X, right? So now we have to calculate this 20%. The Africa sales. And we know that 20% of 1,200 is 240. And also 20% of X is 0.2X. We don't have to, I'm just like using the numbers we have, but of course we know that the 20% of 1,200 would not be enough, because that only represents the 20% of the total that we have out of the other 3 continents. But let's use the number we have, as I said, and we got to 240, which is the 20% of 1,200, and we have 0.2x, and we put them together like so in order to have an equation as such. X equals 240 plus 0.2x. And we want to understand how to remove the 0.2x, right? So you have to get there, in order to remove it, you have to think of x as a 100%, as a whole number. So if you remove 20% of x, you know that if you remove 20% of x, you are left with 80% of x. So 80%, if you write 80%, because we want to get to a number, we want to get to a figure, 80%, if we write it as a decimal number, would be 0.8, because it would be 0.8 of that whole number, which is 1. And I'm sorry if I don't explain very clearly. I'm not an expert in maths, but I'm trying to do my best. So we know that x minus 0.2x equals 0.8x. So the equation becomes here, like we are getting to the point, the equation becomes 0.8x equals 240, right? So it means that 80% of Africa's sales equals 240, right? I mean, that's pretty logical. So to find the full amount, we just have to divide 240, the number that we got, like the 20% of 1,200, which was the sum of the numbers of the items relating to the 3 continents we already had, 240 divided 0.8, and we have, which means we get to 300, right? Of course, you have to make the calculations taking into account all the right decimals, right? So We ultimately know that Africa, in the end, sold 300 products, which makes sense because, I mean, if you also compare it to the other figures, to the other numbers of the other continents, is very much proportionate, especially if you compare it, if you look at the overall amounts and the amounts of the other continents. That's an exercise that I would always do in the context of these calculations. Like it basically confirms that your calculation makes sense. I mean, if it was 3,000, it wouldn't have made sense. That's like, you know, just a sanity check that I always do. Then you had another type of question, which was like more of a type of problem-solving question with numbers. Again, I had quite a few of these questions, and I'm using a relatively simple example to illustrate that, although I have to say some examples, some questions I got were much more difficult. This example is relatively easy, I would say, and I got questions which entailed more, let's say, unknown figures and unknown numbers, and you have to be a bit more elaborated there. But okay, let's look at the example in question that I came up with. So imagine you were told that country A has 10 million inhabitants, and country B has half as many inhabitants as country A. Then you are also told that country C has 80% as many inhabitants as country B. The total population of all four countries is 25 million. How many inhabitants does country D have? So there are four countries, I should have said beforehand. There are four countries, and you have information about three countries and information about the total population of all four countries. So I think that, I mean, this type of question is relatively easy to solve. You start by the first information you have, which is about country A. It has 10 million inhabitants, and you know that country B has half of that, so you easily get to 5 million. Then you have 5 million, and you have to get to the population of a country C, and the country C has 80% of that country B, and you easily get again to 4 million. Now you have the population of three countries, so you add up and you get to 19 million. You have also the total population, which is 25 million, so it's an easy subtraction. You get very easily to 6 million, so country D is 6 million. It sounds as a relatively easy exercise, and I mean, in this case, I have to say it is. You also have this type of questions. They are quite easy, but as I said, you also have calculations that entail more difficulties, less unknown numbers. So again, there you have to work with equations and to work with numbers. You are allowed to use a pen and a paper sheet. So that is, and also a calculator, That is something very important to stress. Bear it in mind when you go through the exercises, but the most important thing is what I will say at the end of the video, which is, I think, the #1 pro tip that you should put in practice when doing these types of tests. But let's move to the third example that I came up with, and then I will share my practical tips and my pro tip and overall how I would tackle this type of test if I were to do it again in the future. So another type of example, another type of question I got, like I got 2 or 3 of these, entailed the meeting scheduling. And it was not a mathematical type of question at all. It was a question, let's say, envisaged to test your ability to organize information quickly. Let's put it like that. And imagine you have to schedule a 13-minute meeting with 3 colleagues. And you have the availabilities of these 3 colleagues. I have to say that some questions entailed availability of 5 colleagues, and you had a slot which was displayed across the across the page, and you had to, you know, figure out how to drag colleagues' images, pictures on the right, you know, slot, and so on and so forth. And that was, you know, quite complex to do. So you imagine you have the availability of of Anna, which is from 9 to 11 a.m., Ben from 10 to 12, and Claire from 9 to 12, but she has another meeting from 10:30 to 11. The question is, when can all these 3 people meet for 30 minutes? So in order to solve it, I would try to first understand when the first 2 are available. So when Anna and Ben are both available. Anna is available until 11, we know it. And Ben becomes available at 10. So their common availability, you come out with the common availability of these 2, and you know that it's between 10 to 11. Now you have to check with the third, which is in this specific example, Claire. Claire cannot meet from 10:30 to 11. We know it because of the question. So that leaves us only with 10 to 10:30. So the only 30-minute slot where everyone is available is 10 to 10:30. Again, this is a relatively easy example, but you will be facing much more difficult examples in the actual text, entailing like availabilities of 5 people and more, let's say, complexities when it comes with the slots. So my first advice here is to read carefully how the question is phrased, what are you supposed to understand, and how you can best identify the available slots for each person as fast as possible. So let's get to my tips on how to tackle and how to approach this type of test, because I think this is the most important part and what many people who are interested to, let's say, familiarize with the type of test and also to set EU competitions may want to know. So first of all, the biggest surprise I had in this type of test was the platform itself. The hardest part was for me actually not how to do the maths, although some equations and some calculations, the numerical part was not easy. It was learning how to use the platform. In my view, the platform was not intuitive at all. So the first thing to do is you need to understand where you can click, where you can actually move the cursor, the mouse around the pages that you are displayed, where objects can be dragged, what you can drag, what you can click on, because depending also on what you click on, you can visualize available information, when and where you need to select an answer versus, for instance, moving an item. I mean, these are 2 different actions that you can do throughout each question and throughout the platform. And sometimes you need to select an answer, sometimes you need to move and drag an item. That is not very, let's say, automatic, that is not very intuitive to understand. And in general, also how the interface reacts, because I found it quite slow in some circumstances. Sometimes you had to select a couple of times, sometimes you had several options to select. So at the beginning, you can, because you have 24 questions in 36 minutes, at least in this first test that the EU institutions are actually testing for these guinea pig candidates. So at the beginning, you can lose valuable time to try and understand how the platform works, how the tool works. And my advice would be, therefore, before taking the real assessment, if you have to take this type of assessment, spend as much time actually practicing on the platform itself, on the SHL platform. As I said, I will provide the link below. And I'm pretty sure that you find many other similar types of tests online. I'm not sure what other provider provides these types of tests. But it's very important to understand the mechanisms of the tool, because this really makes a significant difference in how to tackle the questions, in how you manage your time, and in the end, in the overall result. Because at one point I understood I was spending too much time on the questions, and I skipped a couple because I was just stuck. And the following questions I went much faster, so I managed to reply to 3 or 4 questions in a row, which gave me, at least some confidence. And that is also something very important. So how I would prepare this type of test, if I were to sit it again, I would do these things in this order. First, you learn how to use the platform, understand how the interface reacts, how you select the answers, and how you interact with the object. Secondly, you practice the percentages and the basic equations. That, I think, was the most important and the most complex part. I think it was a bit more difficult than the traditional numerical reasoning that you have in EU tests. So indeed, I think that the most important part, and also the most time-consuming one, is the one concerning the numerical, so-called questions, the maths questions. So I would practice the percentages and basic or even like slightly more advanced equations. It's not advanced mathematics, but you must show the ability, you must have the ability to quickly translate words into calculations, which is something that you have to do also very quickly. Thirdly, I would practice logical reasoning and problem-solving exercises, like, again, what I said about team meetings, organizations, and slots of different people, or like how to match slots with people and availabilities and things like that. Again, this goes hand in hand with the fourth step that I would do, which is to practice scheduling of events, or like tackling, how to tackle items and organizing problems, organizational problems in general. And then, last but not least, I would practice the abstract reasoning. In my personal experience, those questions, the questions about the abstract reasoning, were the easiest. And I found them in general easier than the questions that you normally find in EU tests. So I wouldn't be, if you're familiar and if you are already quite good at abstract reasoning in the context of EU tests, I wouldn't worry too much. The abstract reasoning part was, in my view, the closest to what candidates are already used in the context of these tests. So here is my views about this new EU cognitive assessment test. Who knows whether the EU institutions will use it more and more in the future, and in the context of wider EU competitions, like competitions for external competitions or EPSO competitions. I can't exclude it. I have to say it's always good exercise. As I always say in my videos, I would always try to engage into these tests, to familiarize, to get acquainted to EU tests, especially if you want to go along that path, if you want to have a career in the EU institutions or in international organizations. These tests are organized across the board and by many international organizations. So I would, as I said, try and familiarize myself as much as possible. Overall, I found this EU cognitive assessment test a bit more challenging than EU numerical reasoning and abstract reasoning tests traditionally organized by the EU institutions. As I said, not because of the mathematics, but because of, the combination of several types of tests and the use of a new tool at the same time. That is also a very important thing. And because, as I said, if the EU institutions will keep using these tools, and if this format becomes more and more used in the future, the candidates who prepare successfully and more specifically for this type of assessment will probably have an advantage in the future. That is also, a key thing. If you familiarize and you practice via a specific platform, then you have a significant advantage. I will leave links below to the platform and practice materials, including a Word document that I'm preparing precisely to have these 3 examples that I came up with for people to have a look and to familiarize if you wish to, so you can get acquainted and familiarize with the test as much as possible if you want to take, or if you are to take a similar test in the future. And as I always say, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This is the best way to support me in my YouTube journey and to continue nurturing this channel, because more and more people are interested in this type of content. They are interested in international careers, in careers in the EU institutions. Of course, I speak a lot about international legal careers because I'm a lawyer by background, and I have experience in that respect, but I understand and I get more and more, let's say, requests to talk about EU careers and EU competitions. So here is my contribution for that. We keep in touch. We continue to follow together the same path. And please drop any comment you have in the videos questions. And I try to reply to as many questions as I can. And as usual, to the next one.